Welcome back to our study of the book of 1 Samuel. As you can see, I needed to get a bit of a head start before you here on session 11 because we're covering a large chunk of material. This is by far the largest portion of narrative that we've covered. We're looking at chapters 18 all the way down through 31. And while time is perhaps something of a factor, we don't want this thing to go on forever, there's really a sense in which this is kind of, in some ways, the best way to approach the story of Saul pursuing David. The whole second half of the book is really encompassed under that basic idea. And, there's a couple of stories that we'll pull out from here and make into their own sessions following this one. But in many ways, you really it's sort of like riding a bike. If you pause for too long, you're going to fall to one side or the other. So you just kind of need to keep on going through. And so what I want to do for this portion of the story is I want to walk through the main events, mostly paraphrasing all of it, and then we'll see if we can't draw out a few highlights. This, of course, would be a good time to remember my encouragement early on that you read the text that we're studying before the video so that you have a context for some of these things that I'm going to summarize. So looking at this as a sort of unfolding set of scenes, we begin in 1 Samuel 18, which of course follows 17, the story of David and Goliath. And in the story of 1 Samuel 18, David is on the rise. He's continuing to win successes and victories. He's actually working very much for Saul, and he continues to refer to himself as the servant of Saul, and he in no way presents himself as a competitor of Saul. But other people are starting to talk, and they're saying things like, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And this is beginning to bother Saul. And he already, mind you, has had the blessing of the Lord departed from him. And in this strange phrase of sort of ancient spirituality / psychology, you have the idea of God sending an evil spirit to him. And so this may be a confirmation of the tendencies in which his heart is already going. And much like Pharaoh, God hardens the hardened heart. And so Saul is already in a dangerous place with the Lord. And this manifests itself in his envy toward David. And he's not just sort of envious in a corner. He literally starts attacking him, throwing spears at him while David is over there playing his harp to soothe Saul's anxious spirit. And so you have this beginning of real tension between these two characters in chapter 18. And then it transitions into the next portion of the story, which is essentially where the various characters in the story choose sides. And they're not just characters. I mean, literally, we're talking about Saul's very children. So we've met Jonathan, who is the great hero from chapter 14, and we get to learn more in these portions of the story about Jonathan's famous deep, close friendship with David. They were the best of friends, and they loved each other as themselves, and they were very devoted to one another. And so Jonathan initially talks Saul down from killing David, and he says to him, "You don't want to do this. David has done nothing to you." And Saul actually agrees with him. "You're right. This is not something I want to do." So Jonathan essentially sort of begins to side with David, and then David, who's married to one of Saul's daughters, Michal, or Michael, as we often say her name, she actually finds out that Saul has sent some men to come and kill David, and so she warns him about this, and he gets out before they come, and she puts this sort of fake idol inside the bed with some animal hair in order to fool the people, and they come in and they pounce on it, and it turns out it's not really David. And Saul comes to her and says, "How is it that you could betray me?" And she said she made up a story, which is honestly in the Bible what often persons in positions of weakness do when they're dealing with despots, with powerful people who are drunk on their own power. And so she says, "Oh, he held me at knife point and said that I had to do this or he would kill me." And so Michael chooses sides with David. And it's not just the human characters either. There's this one point in this stories in chapters 19 and 20 when Saul essentially sends it might be a bit of a stretch to call them assassins, but essentially sends some people to capture David so that he might put him to death. And on the way, everybody Saul sends starts prophesying. Like the closer they get to where they believe David is, God overcomes them by his spirit, and they just start prophesying. Then Saul goes himself, and the same thing happens to him. And towards the end of this portion of the narrative, David and Jonathan are talking back and forth, and Jonathan swears to David that my father's not going to kill you. He has made a vow to me that it will not happen. And David says, no, I promise you, he's coming after me, man. This is what's going on. And so Jonathan essentially sets up a scenario where he has a feast and everybody's supposed to come, but he tells David not to come. And then Saul says, "Where's David?" And then Jonathan, said he had some family matters to attend to, and this was a test. And he said, "If my father is not mad about this, then we'll know that he doesn't intend to kill you. But if he is angry, then we'll know that his purposes are indeed precisely this." And Saul shows himself to be against David, and Jonathan shows himself to be on the side of David, and he helps David escape. And so from this point through the end of the book, David really is on the run. And these first couple of chapters in the 20s demonstrate some stories about David being on the run. And he immediately goes to the priest Ahimelech, who he has met multiple times before. And Ahimelech says, where are your men? Why are you here? And I'm off on a mission and I need some food and I need some resources. And so he gives him some of the consecrated bread, actually, that's devoted to the priests, but it's offered to David, this young crowned but not yet king who's in need. And so he gives him the bread and he gives him Goliath's sword, and David is on his way. And he goes on this journey, and it's just, none of these stories are boring, and some of them are iconic. He goes to the city of Gath, where he acted crazy so that the king would not be threatened by him. Maybe you remember that story. Then he goes to the cave of Adullam, where he gathers together a crew of misfits that become his soldiers. And then he goes to the land of Moab, where he finds a temporary safe place for his family. And then to the forest of Herath. And I think there's an intentionality to the way in which the narrative unfolds. He's in the city, he's in the cave, he's in the land, he's in the forest, and he's on the run. He's moving from place to place to place to place, and running away from Saul, who for his part is on the hunt. And so we then pick up with some accounts of his pursuit of David, and he comes to Ahimelech the priest and says, "Why did you help him, the one who is against me?" And Ahimelech is like, he's like your primary servant. He's been fighting your battles for years. How's I supposed to know? And so Saul says, "I'm going to put all of you to death." But Saul's soldiers, once again, are righteous where Saul is not, and they refuse. But there's this one sort of nefarious character, Doeg the Edomite, who puts to death Ahimelech and the priestly families, 85 plus. And there's one young man named Abiathar who escapes and runs to David and tells him what happens. And unlike Saul, who would never take responsibility for anything, David himself says, "This is on me. It is my fault that Ahimelech and the rest of your family have been killed. I will protect you. Come under my care." And then Saul he pursues David while David is fighting against the Philistines. I mean, this is the sort of reversal that's taking place during this phase of the history when the king is coming after the one who is appointed king, when the appointed king is actually fighting the battles that the king is supposed to be fighting himself. And Saul demonstrates his depravity and is just cycling downward further and further and further until we come to these really entertaining stories in chapters 24 and 26. In the middle of 24 and 26, there's the story of Abigail, and that one we're going to pull out and make its own session next time. But what happens in chapter 24 and 26 is that David finds Saul in some vulnerable situations. One time, the first occasion, Saul is actually relieving himself in a cave. And David creeps up behind him and tears off a corner of his robe, cuts it off, and then he comes and he yells from outside the cave. And he actually feels guilty about this. He thinks that he has sinned against Saul. And it's possible that the ripping of part of the robe is in some way symbolic of the kingdom being torn away from Saul. So it may be that David is saying, "I want this kingdom for myself." And if that was indeed part of his motivation, he repents and he apologizes for this. And Saul actually hears him out. But at the same time, David's saying, "But I could have killed you and I didn't." And Saul says, "You're the righteous one. I'm not. I'm sorry." But then you have the story of David and Abigail, which is the interlude here, and it happens again. We again find that Saul is pursuing David, and one night while Saul and all of his men are asleep, David takes some of his men and they go over into Saul's camp, and they take his spear and they take his water jug, and he comes back across the valley to the other side and he hollers out, says, "Why are you still pursuing me? I had another chance to kill you, but I'm not going to because I won't lay a hand against the Lord's anointed." David continues to say, "I won't take vengeance on the Lord's anointed. I don't want to fight you. I don't know why you keep coming after me like this." And Saul once again says, "Oh, I'm sorry, my son. This is not what I should be doing," and yet nothing changes. And so eventually David says, "Man, I got to find a place to live." And so it's kind of interesting and ironic. In chapters 27 through 30, you see that David himself moves and begins to live among the very Philistines. So here you have the man after God's own heart who is called to be the future king, and he's living currently among Israel's enemies. And there's some strange stories in here. You have David going out with these raiding parties and not telling the king of the Philistines all the details. And you have Saul seeking Samuel's guidance from the witch of Endor. That too will become its own session here in a couple different sessions. And eventually, David is wanting to have an opportunity to prove his devotion to the king of the Philistines. But this king Achish is hearing from his men that David's going to turn on you, and so he sends him home. It seems like God is maybe guiding David away from doing something that he might in the end regret. And in the final story of this particular session after David comes back home from wanting to fight with the Philistines. They discover that their village has been burned and their wives and children have been taken. And so the men weep, but then they go and they pursue the Amalekites who had done this terrible thing, and it destroys all of them and takes back what was theirs. And then they come back to the troops that were left behind because they were tired. And some of the soldiers who went on this battle said, we should do away with those weaklings who didn't fight. And David says, no, we will share the spoils of this victory equally. We are a group, we live as a group, we die as a group. And in this case, we've been saved as a group. And so David manifests his leadership in this regard and shows that he's a king who will take care of all of his people. And then you do come to the very end of the book of 1 Samuel. And since I've paraphrased all the way up to this point, I feel it would be most appropriate to read 1 Samuel chapter 31. Here's what it says. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer was terrified and wouldn't do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip to dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. When the people of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. Well, this is, of course, not the end of our study of Samuel because we want to address some of these unique narratives from within this large scope. But this is the point at which the narrative of Samuel comes to an end, with Saul dead, his kingdom in shambles, and David being taken care of and yet not there in the center of action. So what do we do with this? Well, I've tended in these things to start to note some lessons for ourselves and then to end with a thought about God. Maybe we could flip it in this regard and pay attention to one thing that we see about God and then a few things that we learn from some of the main characters. When it comes to God's participation in this portion of the narrative, it seems that you have this twofold dynamic going on where you have God's rejection of Saul on account of Saul's continual rejection of him, and yet God's protection of David. Now, your story your story is not going to be the same as either Saul's or David's in most ways, but it will be long and winding, most likely, with various people and various places and turning points that mean a lot to you, even if not to the outside world. And I think part of what we should draw from this is that wherever you are currently in this story that you're living, wherever you are in this life that's unfolding before you, rest assured that God is on the move. Even in these moments where he doesn't seem to be the primary actor in the story, he is moving because he never stops. And to the extent that you oppose him, he will reject you. But to the extent that you, albeit imperfectly, the extent that you trust and obey him, he will protect you. I see Romans 8:28 here, that God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so from God's vantage point, we have this double dynamic of rejection of the one who has opposed him and disobeyed him, and protection of the one who is trusting. We also have this sort of madness of Saul, this maniacal pursuit of David. And there's no doubt much to be learned here. Saul is deeply troubled to the core. And he actually 3 times he vows that he will not harm David. Once when Jonathan calls him on the injustice of his plans to put him to death in chapter 19, and then when David spares his life in chapter 24, and again when he spares his life in chapter 26. And he continues to say, I'm not going to come after you anymore. And then he comes after him again. What's going on? He's mad. He's losing his mind in certain respects. And why? Well, as with Pharaoh, this is presented as complicated. In the story of Pharaoh's heart being hardened, you have these different types of statements. Sometimes it says Pharaoh hardened his heart. Sometimes it says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Sometimes it says that his heart was hardened. And I think you have the same type of dynamic in here, even if not the same language, that Saul is actively disobeying what God wants. And so then God sends the evil spirit to him to confirm him in these tendencies. And there's this, I don't know if partnership is really not the right word. It's kind of a complex thing to describe, which is, I think, why the Bible depicts it for us in terms of narratives. But the point is, God is no doubt involved in this at some level, but Saul is not off the hook. And perhaps what we need to see when it comes to Saul is the important connection between envy and madness. Your jealousy will drive you crazy if you continue to compare yourself to what God is doing among others. Don't be driven mad by the envy of one like Saul. Perhaps seasoned leaders need especially to hear and take note. Of course, the other character that we see here is David, and there's so many different things we could say about David, but we'll have opportunity to do so. Here, I want to note this theme of vengeance, and it's not in the positive, it's in the negative. I don't know if we should call this David's rise, because he's more like David on the run, but we do see that in certain respects he is rising to this point of readiness to take the throne that is rightfully his. And what stands out most in his own words is this commitment not to fight against the Lord's anointed. You see this in chapter 24 when he finds Saul relieving himself. You see this in chapter 26, and he says to him, I will not lift a hand against the Lord's anointed. I will not take vengeance on the one whom my God has chosen to be the king. And if Saul presents us with a lesson for the seasoned leaders, perhaps David presents us with a lesson for the younger ones. Are you frustrated? Are you frustrated with the leaders under whom by God's providence you find yourself currently? And what might David's treatment of Saul have to teach you in this regard? And then lastly, I don't want to miss, and this will be the last occasion we have to talk about him, I don't want to miss the deference of Jonathan in this story. He by no means is the main character, but we would do well to pay attention to his role. He would have been a great king, but it's not in the cards for him, and he doesn't show an ounce of discontent toward God. He doesn't show an ounce of resentment toward David. In fact, I'm not even sure if you've noticed this yet, but Jonathan, the son of Saul, looks a lot like another Jonathan. He looks a lot like John the Baptist. Both are fine leaders in their own right, but both Johns embrace their role as supportive forerunner to the promised coming king. And when the time comes to fade to black, you get no objections from Jonathan, just like no objections from John. And while this seems to be a strange place to end a story about Saul and David, perhaps it fits. Our job is not, hear this well, our job is not to worry about our place in the hierarchy, our level in the echelons. God will sort things out as he sees fit. Our job is to find our lane and fill it, like Jonathan did. Our job is to defer, first of all, to Jesus and to others whom God may have called to particular tasks, to discern our part and play it well. This story is not about you or me. God is the director. Christ Jesus is the star. Our calling is to say our lines and then exit stage left so all the applause goes where it belongs. Once more, Jesus, the Messiah, our King.